about we start with just like, how are you? I feel like it's a question I ask all Iranians right now because there's all of these additional reports coming out about schoolgirls being poisoned. And I'd love to talk about that, especially our role as academics and scholars or educators, and how we even organize around that. That's a very targeted, very personal thing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, we can just launch in right there because I think that this recent round of poisonings is part of course, this horrific backlash and crackdown that has been going on now for many weeks, trying to suppress the revolution. And at some level, one is sort of continually shocked by like the new horrors that seem to unfold. This poisoning really, I mean, I think it's an unprecedented thing. I mean, the Islamic Republic has never tried to ban girls from being educated, right? They instituted gender segregation, but they never tried to keep girls out of school. And in fact, of course, literacy rates went up for women and girls after the revolution, as we know. So this seems to me to be just a really kind of new twist, where schoolgirls were really active in this uprising. As you well know, and we watched from Diaspora these incredible videos of young teenagers, middle school girls shouting down government officials, chanting women, life, freedom, absolutely refusing to be intimidated, to be shamed, to be subordinated, and really just defying like all the rules, just crossing every red line, right, that had been imposed on them. And I feel like they're being punished. They're being systematically and outrageously punished for, sort of daring to become agents of historic change, for daring to help lead and sustain this sort of radical feminist reorientation of Iranian society. And so this is just kind of the latest, and again, like really, really twisted, really like a new thing, like to try to punish these girls. And I think Iranians are outraged, and I think that all of these acts of violence, the arrests, executions, the horrific tortures that have happened to protesters in prison, all of this, I think, serves to just, increase the profound alienation that so many Iranians feel from their government. It's not a way to win hearts and minds or credibility or peace or anything, right? It's a way perhaps to push people off the streets temporarily, but only until, right, something explodes again. And in fact, I was just hearing briefly today that, of course, there have been protests against these poisonings, right? Teachers, parents. We've seen videos of the mothers of some of these young girls, protesting, demanding officials be held to account and facing, being beaten in the streets. I mean, I'm just thinking of one video in particular. So it's not as if people just accept the situation. I think it's really volatile. And that the revolution is, it's in danger, right? It's in danger because of this internal repression. And then maybe we can talk about some of the other foreign threats that I think, and maybe some of the problems even in our own diaspora, where I think it's going to be a continual challenge to really keep the focus on the feminist core of what this uprising has really been about.
Yeah, and there's a feminist core, but there's also a real centering of this revolution around students. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of thing also about your book around that I have right here, about Iranian revolutionaries in the USA and the role of the ISA and in creating all these alliances with different ethnic and racial groups in the US. But specifically just making me think about this long history of specifically students in protesting the state and the government and violence. And I think one of the things that's really extraordinary for me watching Iran is the government is very aware of the role of students and the power of students. And we're not just talking about university students, which we know that they were going into Sharif University and they took Sharif University literally hostage. And also that the state has been parking fake ambulances, in schoolyards, and then literally rounding up students and putting them in there and taking them to prison. But then also just school age girls. So we're talking about like 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds. We're talking about really young girls. And the role of the government in kind of impact of going in and trying to repress them. I read a report today that on, I think it was 1500 Tasfir, about how the IRGC was going into girls' schools and showing pornographic rape videos to terrify them in terms of like this is how we will be punishing you. But just the level of trauma that they're dealing with after that, and yet I still am not quite sure. We have to respond, I think, as educators. I mean, I think this is the thing that we must do. I would love to hear from you about what you think we can do from the diaspora among Iranians, but also non-Iranians, and what is the responsibility of educators when we see this happening en masse?
Yes, well,
I think at this point, the other report is that I think it's been 300 schools around Iran. There have been reported 10 deaths of these girls. This is like literally chemicals coming in out of the air vents, and girls being trapped inside. So I remember when I was looking at the video a couple days ago of a father trying to jump the locked fence of a school trying to get his daughter, and I was thinking about Uvalde. And how the parents were literally being kept out of the school by the police. And they wanted to go and protect their kids. So just really thinking about the role of the state repression and how schools are used to be able to oppress young people and to be able to terrify their parents. And then what our role is as educators and as activists to kind of really counter that on a global scale. That's a lot, but I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, this, just in this conversation, what I'm thinking about is, I think it's no coincidence that students often play a leading role in revolutionary movements and struggles. And yes, it's been traditionally more university students, but I think that we also have, even in 1979, high school students were really involved in the revolution. And, one of my favorite images from the documentary Iranian Women's Liberation Movement Year Zero, which is about the women's uprising that happened in Tehran in March 1979, one of my favorite images is actually a group of high school girls participating in a mass sit-in against mandatory hijab and gender discriminatory rules that were beginning to be, advanced. And so I think there is a sense, that, children are politicized and are political and have political consciousness and are full human beings in the world, and I think that it's really incredible when young girls, when young people feel empowered to have a say in transforming their own society. Like, to me, that's one of the most wonderful and hopeful signs that a revolution is really not about, hatred and revenge and negation, but that it's really about creation, about love and joy, about making the world that you want to live in, right? That when you see young people empowered to fight on behalf of themselves, for their own liberation, to feel part of that struggle, right? And so, what we're seeing now is just like a horrific backlash, horrific punishment, so much violence and brutality. And I think for us in diaspora, I think that when, we have to speak out. And when the Iranian security forces took over Sharif University, many universities where I work, Barnard, Columbia included, faculty mobilized, we issued statements condemning this violence, demanding, right to an education as a basic thing, and expressing our solidarity with faculty and students. And, many of us also called on our university administrations to condemn this violence. Not so much success on that front, but faculty certainly mobilized and were willing to put their names down and really publicly, decry this violence. And And I think that, a big part of it, and maybe this is a segue to the more historical focus of the book, which I think has so much resonance for the present, so we can keep tacking back and forth in time. But one of the things that I've learned from studying the history of the Iranian Students Association, the Confederation of Iranian Students that they were part of, the whole anti-Shah formation of the 60s and 70s, is that it really matters to connect the liberation movement in Iran with other liberation struggles, right? Not to see Iran in isolation or in a vacuum. And I think that's even more true post 79, when Iran sort of hyper stigmatized as this Islamic Republic pariah state, right? That's been in so many ways shut out of the global system, the kind of, world, the normative world of nation states, right? Iran is sort of always, pushed outside of that. And so there's a tendency, I think, for scholars and even activists to really think about Iran, sort of on its own terms, as if it's this unique, special case, And of course, every country has its specificity and its history, and we need to be incredibly grounded in that and attentive to that. But I also think that, we're living in a time where authoritarianism is a global phenomenon, rising fascist movements in many parts of the world, including in the West, including in this country. I know a lot of scholars in ASA work on, study the right and study, fascism and these kinds of threats. And I'm always pushing to say, what would it mean to think about the kind of the crisis in Iran, the structural oppressions in Iran in relation to, other phenomenon. For example, the issue of Islamic fundamentalism, right? How can we think that in relation to Hindu fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, Zionist fundamentalism, right? There are many religious fundamentalisms, going on in the world right now. Some of them are deeply imbricated with settler colonialism. Some of them are, directly challenging women's bodily autonomy in various ways. Again, it's not that it's the same. And sometimes Iranians don't like when you try to make relational arguments or comparisons because they only want to talk about Iran. But, I think if we care about solidarity, and if we care about making Iran a site of what I call in the book affects of solidarity, especially among non-Iranians, we have to be able to make connections between our struggles against patriarchal state violence and mass incarceration and, and on and on and on, right? Because I think that they are deeply connected. And I think that we do have an opportunity to learn from each other's struggles and to kind of get ourselves out of the box where Iran is only seen through a kind of lens of Islam, and we can't kind of think about its state structures and forms and even modes of domination as having anything in common with other state forms of regulation of gender and sexuality. So I think there's been some interesting development on those fronts, which maybe we can talk about a bit later. But I do think that one of the key lessons from the 60s and 70s is about making Iran matter to non-Iranians and linking the Iranian liberation struggle to the liberation movements of others.
I think we are at a moment right now where what you're saying is just so key. And when I read your book, which was published in November, I was like, this is just freaky deaky that this came out now, because it's exactly the book that we need. You are so on point when you say that we need to connect these different fundamentalisms to develop this affects of solidarity, which you kind of coined and conceptualized throughout your book, but also just it's like the primary way this regime is going to fall, because all these fundamentalist ideologies and regimes around the world right now are enabling each other, right?
Yes,
so just
exactly.
From a very practical activist perspective, I think this is actually the only strategy that's going to work. It's not like we can topple one and like let the other stay in place, right? They support and enable each other, and we can see that through the way the UN votes come through. We can see that through, who's selling weapons to whom. So I think that is exactly key. And I would love to see, when you said that we're starting to see kind of movement around that, I would love to know what you're talking about, because that's very exciting.
Sure. I mean, just briefly, I think there are probably many examples that we could draw from. So this is not meant to be comprehensive at all, but just in terms of what I'm connected to and seeing in my own, activist life, is that I think there is a particular energy being put into thinking regionally. So thinking about Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, Syria, the Kurdish struggle, and we could talk for a long time about the Iran's connections to these places and struggles, and also some of the problems, right? Where Iran is often the oppressor, for example, intervening in Iraq and systematically denying Afghan migrants any kind of rights and really horribly oppressing Afghan, and it really is to think regionally, especially around Palestine, which we could also talk for a long time about. You have to totally think from the bottom up. You have to stop thinking like the governments, right? You have to stop choosing between Israel versus Islamic Republic, and you have to start thinking grassroots solidarity, right? What would it mean for Iranians to, support liberation for Palestinians, right? Not through the lens of the Islamic Republic and its cynical manipulation of the Palestinian movement for its own foreign policy ends, but actually about people's liberation, actually about human liberation, or what would it mean for Iranians who a lot have grown up with very anti-Afghan racisms, right? To actually break from that and to support, Afghans in Iran should have equal citizenship and equal rights too. Like, can that be part of our liberation project, right? And also to be in solidarity with the struggles of Afghan women, facing the Taliban. And so in some of the chants, you've began to hear some of this, like, no to the Taliban from Kabul to Tehran. It rhymes in Farsi, but these kinds of like thinking in relation that we have to defend the rights of women and girls, in both of these countries, that there are active struggles going on in both of these countries that we have to support and think together. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in terms of people trying to think regionally. And then I think it's also global. Like, I think with the, in particular, the Feminist for Jiyan network that I'm connected to, had a day of action on November 25th, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It's a day against femicide, and it's a day that emerges from the struggle of Caribbean and Latin American women, actually, against, in particular, 3 sisters who were murdered by the Trujillo dictatorship, in the 1950s. And so there's a longer history of Latin American women struggling against patriarchal dictatorships, right? And femicide and state repression and the gendered and sexualized forms that state violence takes. And so, to have a network of Iranian feminists decide we're going to hold an action on this day, and then many groups of Iranians around the diaspora performed the Chilean feminist song, "A Rapist in Your Path," or "The Rapist Is You," in Persian, changing the lyrics somewhat, right, to include some of the specificity of the Iranian context, but nonetheless picking up and borrowing a form of performance protest from the context of the Latin American movements against neoliberalism and authoritarianism, and the efforts of feminists in Latin America to bring a feminist politics and a feminist critique of state repression into those larger struggles. So having Iranian feminists, be actually trying to weave their struggle into that larger fabric of revolutionary feminist movements, I think is very significant. It's very important. And, I think on March 8th, International Women's Day, there's a number of different events happening where, again, you have Iranians speaking side by side with Afghans and Kurds and, others, and really trying to think across these borders and boundaries and contexts together. So that I do think that the space of diaspora is really conducive to that. It's not an automatic process, but it's a huge opportunity. Again, not unlike what I found in my inquiry into the solidarity movements in the 60s and 70s, or what we call third world internationalism, from that era, that the space of diaspora because of the way that US imperialism produces diasporas, produces migrations, people actually end up getting to meet each other, you know, and sort of compare notes and learn about each other's liberation movements back home when they are in the space of diaspora. And so I think the opportunity to be, for example, in New York City, where we can actually have meetings with Afghan and Kurdish and Iraqi and, you know, other women connected to movements in their home contexts, right? Like that's a huge opportunity for all of us, really.
So are those actions happening?
Yeah, so the November 25th action happened, right? Those were rallies that happened across Europe and in different cities in the US. And then
was that the Chilean, the one where the Iranian were seeing the Chilean grant? Was that happening?
That happened in November. That happened, they filmed it in Berlin, London, New York, many different cities, I think Montreal. It became, it became a kind of way for Iranian women in diaspora, and I actually just finished an essay about this, but to kind of embody the revolution themselves, right? To put their own bodies into motion, even though we're not there, we're not on the streets, we weren't on the barricades, you know, we couldn't physically be there bodily, and yet, you know, we also have our own affective attachments to a free Iran, right? To liberation, to revolution in Iran, what I think of as revolutionary affects in the book, right? We have those affective desires and attachments and orientations, and performing that Chilean feminist song was like an opportunity for women in diaspora to really, manifest those revolutionary affects bodily, and to put their bodies in motion, you know, in solidarity and to, you know, I mean, it's a really powerful song if you've seen it or action.
No, I would love to see it. I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
But I love how you're thinking about this, but also the possibility of being in the diaspora and the kinds of organizing that can be done in the diaspora that maybe are not possible inside of Iran. So I think one of the big questions that I've been asking is just to myself and to others is, what is the responsibility of Iranians in the diaspora to Iranians who are living in Iran?
Yeah.
And those of us who are in exile, but who may have come here and have become exiled in the process of being but I think that this is like a very key point that you're making, is that one of the things that we can do is to build solidarity with others, and kind of like develop these frameworks that demonstrate the connections between these different forms of oppression. One of the things that I thought was, just to go, you made such great points. I've been taking notes. The no to the Taliban from Kabul to Tehran. I mean, some reports that came out recently were that the Taliban has replaced the Taliban are now coming in and taking over the embassies in different countries. So in the Tehran embassy, in the Afghani embassy in Tehran, it's now been taken over by the Taliban. That's also happened in China. It's happening in like a few key regions. So I think that is very key, especially when we think about how we lobby to the US and like how we advocate to the US. So, we remember, in the early 2000s, kind of, this way that the US legitimized its invasion of Afghanistan in terms of saving brown women.
Yeah.
And saving Afghani women. But then, Afghani women, schools have been shut down. They're not able to even go to schools. The Taliban has completely taken over. And this, seeing it also happening in Iran now, the government poisoning schoolgirls so that it basically terrifies them from going to school, terrifies their parents from sending them to school. It's such a eerie parallel. But the fact that like the US would still continue to engage with this regime, even amidst this kind of femicide and these threats of femicide, is really intense. And the other point
sorry, go ahead.
No, there was another point that you had made around the other point, just to what I want to put a really like a thick point on from your points is that I think the coalition and the connections and the alliances and these kinds of shows of solidarity with different women and different oppressed groups is not just important on a semantic or a cultural level, but it's because the oppression is actually being instituted through alliances that fundamentalist regimes are making with each other.
Right.
And so, for example, I recently learned in the last few months the way that the Islamic Republic has been training Shiite armies in regions around the Middle East, and that part of the kind of the terrorism that really goes on and the instability in the Middle East is because of these warring factions between Sunni armies and Shiite armies, Sunni armies being kind of funded by Saudi Arabia and Shiite armies being funded by Iranians. And the reason, the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic, the reason why that's important is because there have been numerous reports over the last 6 months of these Shiite armies from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from Syria, going into Iran to oppress Iranian people, right? As an extension of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. So I think that that's also something to really think through, is this that the way that the oppression is actually being connected in the state sponsored, trained, strategized oppression, the way that that's actually being instituted around the Middle East necessitates what you're saying. It's so, meaning it's not a theoretical thing what you're saying. It's it sounds really good from an academic perspective piece.
Right.
What you're saying really hits me on a very core level, because I feel like there's no other way to go, because the way that these regimes have actually collaborated with each other and used militarism they've been building alliances, right? Borders. And so that's how they're then continuing to oppress their own peoples.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, all of this happens in the context of, more than 20 years of the US-led war on terror, right? Which, I mean, as we all know, the US funded, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda against the Russians. We have, history has been going on for a long time in terms of what has led to the current crisis, right? And I think that, you said before, what is our role in diaspora? What is our sort of ethical, role here? And I always think, because, we have to be aware, of course, of our positionality and our location. And I think it's always a challenge and a struggle, and an important one to think through is how to, be able to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. In other words, we have to be able to condemn the US wars in the region, the militarization of the region, the cynical pitting of religious factions against each other. I mean, Iraq, the US set up that government that organized, sectarian war campaign, basically. So, we have more than one source of oppression, right? But we have this kind of overarching, context of the US war on terror, that I think is always sort of the container that everything else is unfolding within, in the region, and so I think that for Iranians, I think that we always have to be able to condemn the violence of the Islamic Republic and the violence of US empire at the same time. And it's not as if they're equal. I mean, obviously the US has the world as its stage, right? And can intervene militarily anywhere in the world, and has military bases all over the world, and, has a vastly larger impact. However, I absolutely agree with you that Iran is a regional imperial power, and that that the Iranian government's machinations in other people's countries become an obstacle to the liberation movements of those people too. So in Iraq, when they had, big uprising, and forgive me if I'm going to get the date wrong, but I think it was 2018, 2019, there was big demonstrations, and the slogans were like against the US and Iran. It was like US out and Iran out. that people understand Iran or experience Iran as another occupying force through its funding and backing and training of these groups. As you're talking about, everybody knows they're financed by the Islamic Republic. So yeah, it's like, how do we actually develop a politics that's nuanced and complex and capacious enough to be able to start with how people there are experiencing what is the main source of oppression, and then what is the larger context in which all of this is unfolding, and it's just really, it's really hard, right? Because, we want to be, very clear about the barbarism and the horror of the Islamic Republic. And we have to acknowledge the US has committed so much barbarism and horror and terrorism, throughout the region, right? And so it puts us in the US in a very particular place, right? Where we have to we have to have this double critique, I think, all the time, because our own government has created so much destruction and damage and set in motion some of the most reactionary formations, imaginable, ISIS and these things, right? That you can't imagine that happening without all of the war and destruction of, people's societies. That's what produces such extreme, and so I think that's the larger context that we're always grappling with, right? How to talk about from our location.
It's tricky too, because I get feedback sometimes. It's not consistent, but it is a kind of discourse that happens around how the Iranian diaspora needs to just sit down and shut up because we are westernized, and that we are basically like America speaking, but through us, right? Through an Iranian body, or like a Iranian body, literally, but it's actually an American voice, and it's an American perspective, and it represents American interests and all the rest. And I think that's been the trickiest thing to figure out how to counteract, especially for many of us who, I've lived in exile for, 40 plus years, because not out of choice, right? My family literally can't go back after the 79 revolution. So I think that is really tricky. And I think part of what's driving that is a lack of historical engagement or understanding. I was watching a video interview with the former Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, and from 1982, and he was saying, the history, literally, the way that the regime has been set up is that history started when the Ayatollah Khomeini came into power, and that this is now the history that is taught. And one of the things that I really appreciated about your book that I think is, ironic, because so many Iranian scholars are historians and talk about history and they write histories, but they rarely think about actually the historical materialism or historiography in this more critical or engaged way. And I think in your book, you really do that in several ways. You one, reperiodize what you call reperiodizing the diaspora, because the way we think about ourselves is like pre-1979, then post-1979, right. But really thinking, really breaking that timeline apart. And then the second place where I actually cried when I was reading it was your last chapter. I'm going to keep it together, but your last chapter, which is your conclusion on revolutionary affects and the remaking of the diaspora, where you talk to just the kind of the mourning of like looking back at Iran and looking back at the critiques of the Shah and the Shah's reign in Iran in relation to so many of these Iranian activists who have been now having to live here because of the Islamic regime taking over, and having them really reflect on that and the kind of the mourning process, and also just how complicated that is for activists who were, resisting and critiquing like a former regime and a former way things are, but then also inevitably the nostalgia that comes from not being able to go back, and from the extreme different forms of violence and oppression that have been instituted over the last 40 years through a very different kind of regime. So I think that work that you did from a history perspective, and even your invocation of Benjamin, and thinking about how like our choice now is just to we have to just go back and like pick up the wreckage of the past, right? This is the only way that we can really engage what this is. And it feels so complicated. My focus has been primarily on Black American history here in the US, and solidarity between people of color in the US, and film history. So for me, Iranian history has always been something that's very separate, and it's been something I've been like seriously like trying to download over the last 6-7 months. But my head is exploding with these kinds of questions, and your book really helped me kind of just start to figure out how to organize.
Well,
You know,
maybe I can jump in and thank you for sharing all these reactions to the book. And, it's so meaningful for me to hear how it's being received. And believe me, I cried so many times writing that book. I mean, I can't even tell you.
But I could feel it as you were writing, which I think is so rare for an academic book, but I felt it,
Yeah, I'm glad you felt it, because it is, I'm writing about feelings and affect, so the book should somehow move people, I would hope so. So thank you for that feedback. And I mean, maybe if I can try to connect some of the threads, because you've said a lot of really important things. And so I think that, the criticism that people in the diaspora are westernized and Americans and should sit down and shut up. This is for me, I mean, this is like a weird identity politics. And like, I am very much interested in queer critiques of diasporic, nationalism and all of these things about the authenticity and, but I think that the issue really politically becomes, when somebody says, oh, you're American, it's like, what America are we talking about? Like, you work on solidarity with Black liberation movements. It's like, is America the government and US interests in the Middle East and thinking like the state? Or is America the site of its own long unfinished freedom struggles, right? And like, so I think that's always the challenge for diasporic populations. How do you situate yourself in this settler colonial society built on the theft and genocide, theft of land, genocide, transatlantic slavery, and on and on and on. It's like, how do we situate ourselves? Do we situate ourselves in solidarity with the inheritors of those histories and the ongoing struggles, right? For justice, for social justice and transformation in this country? Or do we situate ourselves with the kind of elite of the United States that imagines the US as a sort of benign democratic force in the world that should enforce some kind of human rights around the world, and we pretend that its own record is so I mean, I don't have to tell you this, right? So I mean, and I think scholars connected to the ASA, I mean, the ASA has become one of the main academic sites for the study of US empire and thinking about racial capitalism and indigenous struggles and all of the kind of tremendous losses of capitalist modernity that we are still, sifting through those remains and drawing on those remains for sources of energy and new struggle and possibility, right? So I think it's all about which America, right? It's like, which America are we in? And
but this point that you're making is so critical, because it's like, I mean, we met at a conference where I was like, how is no one else talking about this right now? I mean, this is the thing that's really been striking me about over the last 6-7 months, trying to kind of speed up with Iranian diaspora studies, with Iranian studies. I'm really shocked that it feels like really only you and maybe a couple of like brand new scholars are even starting to like I mean, you have a fully developed kind of conceptual framework for this, and like you're really thinking it through. You've been at the ASA. This is your intellectual formation as it is mine. But how is it? How is it just you? Like it's such an obvious point you are making, and yet I am so confused about what has happened with Iranian studies and any kind of engagement around this.
Yeah. I mean, Iranian studies is an area studies model. So it's not been historically engaged with the diaspora at all. That is starting to change because of the work of people like Dr. Persis Karim and, other people who for years have been like, hello, there's a diaspora, but also, and this was a point actually that Farzaneh Hamasi made in a talk she gave at the last Iranian Studies conference, where she said, in fact, Iranian studies as a field is a formation of the diaspora. I mean, all of y'all are in diaspora. I'm sorry. Like, we are a diasporic field, and we have to stop pretending that, the diaspora is not an important or legitimate site of study and inquiry, right? So I think there's been a lot of interventions, right, to try to begin to shift things. But I think it just, in some ways there's just like, a right place and a right time, a kind of historic conjuncture that kind of happens where, like, those of us who grew up in the US and were formed by anti-racist movements here, right? We were formed kind of by a US social justice milieu, right? Where we try to think with that lens about Iran, and, not all of it, you can't map all of it onto Iran. You can't take a US social justice model and transpose it like onto Iran in a simplistic way. But you can begin to think about, like, okay, there are genealogies of, third world feminism and Black feminism that came out of anti-colonial and anti-racist movements and brought these critiques of patriarchy, gender, and sexual oppression into the anti-racist movement, and brought critiques of racism into the feminist, like, how do we actually then think about the question of diaspora in that process, but also like how these processes unfolded for other groups. Like, Iranian women were part of the Iranian Revolution, and they were part of the diasporic wing of that revolution that I study. And through their participation in a larger anti-colonial or anti-imperialist movement, they began to also bring in critiques of gender and sexual oppression within their own culture and society and organizations, right? Because ultimately, if you're fighting for freedom, you want that to include your own freedom.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess this is where I'm going to ask you, though, like, what happened? Because you talk about it in your book, kind of like how you think that the Iranian diaspora kind of like how did this criticality shift? Because your point around, how do you position yourself in this settler colonialist kind of place? Like, how do you position yourself how do I position myself as an Iranian American within relation to the American government and the state and its violence is the way I've always thought about it because I grew up in Atlanta. It was Black people who cared for me when I felt alienated from like my communities and was like just this queer kid like running around not understanding anything. And so my formation as a woman of color happened like pretty much through like early and through college, but it was always like central for me. And I always thought about it as like, if I'm living on this land that my ancestors did not build with their sweat or with their, and it's someone else's land, this is the least I can do is dedicate my life to this work, right? What happened with other Iranians? Because it's so rare to find an Iranian now. And even as I connect with Iranians now, people are always like, oh, thanks for like talking about Black people or posting about Black people on your Instagram. It's so cool to see an Iranian care. And I'm like, this is so weird because I don't understand how everyone else has been thinking. And so your history, I mean, in this book, it seems like, oh, like everyone was like, all these Iranian students were like radicals. And then hopefully they had like kids or like they raised other radicals somehow. And so we should be more radical, but like what happened? What happened to us as a diaspora that we became so in alignment with kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's like a huge question, right? And so, I mean, one big thing that happened is, of course, that the left was crushed, in Iran and in many other places, and in the U.S. too. Quite frankly, there was so much repression, and a historical era ended and a new one began, and the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, I've argued, kind of precipitate this whole shift from the kind of Cold War to the war on terror, the post-war boom years to the neoliberal austerity years, the rise of the right, Ronald Reagan, backlash against leftist movements, vicious kind of retrenchment of racism, a kind of taking away of many of the gains of the 60s and 70s civil rights movements, and on and on. So there's been this really vicious backlash, against the working class and against people of color and immigrants, that we've been living through. And, because of the revolution and hostage crisis, you got a whole new wave of permanent migration. Many of the people who came, they were, I'm overgeneralizing, but they were well off. They benefited from kind of Western capitalist modernization under the Shah. They were quite aligned with that project. And they lost a lot, they lost wealth and status in their country, And so part of what I look at in the last chapter of the book is, if that's been the dominant narrative about who the diaspora is, what they're nostalgic for, what they lost, what about the losses of leftists, who are not mourning for the good life under the Shah and kind of those good old days, but are mourning for the loss of that hope and that possibility of a kind of, revolutionary future, a socialist future, a more democratic future, the other Iran that never came to be, right? What if they're mourning the loss of those possibilities, right? And how those losses haven't really been able to be publicly mourned or talked about very much because of this more dominant formation, which Hamid Nafisi has written many books about in his study of exilic television, of course, and really talks about this kind of, the way that the kind of upper class, entrepreneurial, pro-Western cohort of Iranians, came to the US and, oriented themselves around their class privilege and also around, claiming whiteness or that kind of Aryan nationalist mythology from the Pahlavi regime that gets transposed here in a climate in which there is tremendous anti-Iranian racism. And Iran is like a dirty word, and people hate you if you're Iranian. I mean, we grew up with this, right? I mean, we remember this, the yellow ribbons everywhere in solidarity with the hostages, and just tremendous, what Mohsen Mobasher has called Iranophobia, just tremendous anti-Iranian sentiment, often leading to hate crimes, violence, whatever, it was really a horrible time. So that was also a moment in which, a lot of the kind of like broader third worldist coalitions and formations were being decimated, were falling apart. And, the Iranians who came here were not oriented on anti-imperialism. Their country had just been, sort of to them, taken away from them or stolen from them in the name of anti-imperialism. So, I think it becomes very tricky, right? So it's something about the kind of race and class orientation of the group. It's something about the tremendous hostility coming at them. It's something about the decline of the left overall. And, the fact that a lot of people of color in the US are getting reoriented around identification with the US military. There's a huge attempt to overcome the Vietnam syndrome, to rehabilitate the US military as a source of good in the world. A lot of people of color get recruited into that project. I mean, there's so many pieces to it. But just the last thing that I'll say about it is that I think that the next generations that have grown up here experiencing racism, Neda Makboulleh writes about this in her book, there has been a tendency, especially post 9/11, for younger Iranians to identify with other people of color, to see themselves as people of color, to understand themselves as racialized, as part of the same kind of matrix of foreign wars and domestic surveillance and Islamophobia and new concepts like SWANA, Southwest Asia, North African, have come into being as kind of political concepts to try to build solidarity among very diverse communities that have been targeted, in the war on terror. So I think there have been a lot of shifts and changes in terms of how Iranians have oriented themselves. But I think it's harder to build solidarity between Iranians and other groups of people around Iran, because the Iranian government is not a puppet of the US, right? It really is a sovereign state. And so if most of the US left is oriented around opposing US imperialism, and that's not enough for Iran. You have to also be able to oppose the Islamic Republic. And I think that's where a lot of other people of color, leftists involved in other movements, where they're obviously in solidarity with everybody fighting US imperialism, they're not so obviously in solidarity with Iranians because of the way the Islamic Republic positions itself. So that's another big problem that we have to overcome. So it's like we should do like a mapping one day of like all the difficulties and problems that have over time worked to make it so that it's not the default position, right, for Iran to be included in a kind of list of struggles or countries, or it's not part of the lexicon of the kind of anti-imperialist left or people of color left, in this country.
I love the idea of doing that mapping. I feel like it would very much calm my brain down, because it's so complicated to a certain part. One of the tricks of also getting people to engage in bringing down this regime is also just people are like, oh, I'm not qualified, because it's so many different aspects.
Yeah, I think ultimately, Iranian people in Iran are going to have to be the ones, right, who, I believe in self-emancipation, self-determination, right? And the question is, how do we in diaspora make more space for them, support them, and, try to, again, like make Iran a site of affective solidarity for others, make it connected to other struggles. And I think also, we do have to be vigilant, because I think, unfortunately, the US and Israel, do still very much have on the table various military options, that would make everything worse. When we were talking about Afghanistan initially, and the kind of excuse of saving women, or, and what always comes to mind is I had the pleasure to meet Malalai Joya, who's an Afghan feminist and member of the first post-invasion parliament. And she was summarily evicted from parliament for denouncing the warlords who the US had put in power for being just as big misogynists, rapists, corrupt, anti-women as the Taliban. And she always said, Afghan women have three enemies: the US occupation, the Taliban, and the warlords, the Northern Alliance, who were the US's allies on the ground. And, sometimes it's really like that. There's no good power source from above that we can ally with. And that's really hard, because, how do Iranian people amass enough power to overthrow their government? We know they've been able to do it in the past. It's not certainly impossible, but it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. And I think what would make it even harder is any kind of, outside military intervention, certainly, because and even when they threaten that, it makes it harder for Iranians on the ground, because that's the Islamic Republic uses that as an excuse to repress, its own people, and to label them all CIA agents or Western agents, right? So Iranian people are really caught. We talked about how these different sources of oppression work together, even when they're not in alignment geopolitically. In fact, it's at the intersection of these imperial, meddling, sanctions, threats of war, all of that, and the state repression from the Islamic Republic. That's what gets in the way of Iranian people having the space to actually organize, to build opposition parties, to formulate demands. And and of course people are trying, but you can't even have a meeting without getting arrested, right? It's very, very difficult to create that alternative, right? So how do we in diaspora try to keep our own government, at bay, and try to create space and really uplift those voices that are challenging, that are challenging every aspect of oppression in Iran, gender, sexuality, class, and of course the religious and ethnic minorities, that have been oppressed for so long. Like, this is a moment in which all of those grievances coalesced right? And there's the potential for a truly intersectional kind of revolutionary politics that has not really been possible before, you know? So like, how do we remember that and hold on to that? Because it can all too quickly be drowned in sort of repression and you know, blood, really. And so how do we in diaspora also try to hold on to you know, the early weeks of this revolution and remind everybody what is possible, right? What people were trying for, so that, you know, we don't sort of give in to despair.
I think that last point about how there's an intersectional revolution that's possible right now in Iran that's never been possible before is a really good one to end on, because it's extraordinary to see it's not just it is, this movement is being led by young people and by students and by women and girls, but it is also men and boys and gender nonconforming and queer people and their parents and healthcare workers and factory workers and business owners and lawyers and activists and musicians and rappers and scholars who are just like all coming together, but also the alliances between formerly kind of I don't know if the word is warring, but like at odds tribes, so and different ethnicities of people is really extraordinary. You know, I think there's a chant. At first, they were saying a chant of "Natarsin ma ba hamdige hastim," which means like don't worry, we're all together. And then it shifted a few months later to be "Bitarsin ma ba hame hastim," which means you guys should be afraid because we're all together.
Yeah, telling the security forces, you be afraid. Yeah,
exactly. You guys be afraid. And I think that like shift is like really amazing, from like, you know, like kind of you know, taking care of ourselves to like, don't be afraid, we're all together, to actually the regime needs to be afraid because we're all together. Exactly. You know, this is like Kurds, Azeri, Baluch people, all of the people, you know, coming together. I think that's unprecedented in Iranian history. Yeah. It's really helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Roya, for this wonderful conversation. I really had it was very challenging and wonderful to talk to you. So thank you.
It was nice to talk to you too. Thank you again for your book, for your work. And we'll be in touch more. And I'm going to be in touch about the mapping of problems, because I actually think that would be very helpful on a broader scale.
Yeah, we gotta write this down. We gotta sketch this out.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.